And we are live again with a new episode of DiEM Goes Local. I'm very happy today to have all this company. Let me introduce you Rhona McCord. She's a left-wing trade union activist and former parliamentary assistant in the Houses of the... Help me to say the Irish name of the Irish Parliament. Rhona, please.
Oireachtas.
Thank you. She currently works at Unite, the union in the Republic of Ireland. And we have also here with us Dave Gibney. He is a trade union activist and works for Mandate Trade Union. He's a coordinator of for the Right to Water Ireland campaign and hosts the Week at Work podcast. And also, I'm very happy to say that today I'm not the only host here. We have another DiEM member with us for this episode. And we have Agnes Dana. And she will help me here with the conversation. She's a particular interest in industrial relations and workers' rights. Hi, everybody. I would start, so we are here today to talk about the workers' rights in Ireland at the general level, and in particular about the present situation in the post-lockdown. What was the impact of COVID for the workers? What kind of mobilizations there are at the moment? As we are a pan-European movement, and some of our members are watching us from out of Ireland. I would ask our guests to give us a little bit of context, or also maybe a little bit of historical context about industrial relations here. And also about, let's start first from your unions. Rhona, which is your union and what sector it's cover? And then we go maybe for the contest.
Okay, well, I work for Unite, the union, which is a union that's based in the UK and Ireland across 7 regions. We're organised north and south across the border in Ireland and across the sectarian, if you like, community divide. We represent mostly private workers, but we do represent some public workers. And the sectors that we would be organised in would include construction, energy, finance, and general workers. You know, recently we've founded a branch in representing hospitality workers in the hospitality and tourism sector. And even more recently, we've established a branch amongst driving instructors in Ireland who are suffering greatly because of the pandemic and the lack of regulation and clarity around rules and health and safety in their jobs. So that's basically us. We've got 1.3 million members across Ireland and the UK, and we're a political trade union. We're actively involved in politics, in left-wing politics, and representing working class people throughout.
Thank you. And Dave, what about your union? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I work for Mandate Trade Union, which is the retail, bar and administrative workers union. So I'd say 90% of our members are in the retail trade, a mix between grocery, drapery, and then even pharmacy workers. So Boots and Lloyd's Pharmacy and Macaulay's and a whole range of those pharmaceutical companies. We, as I say, have bar workers, many of whom are now out of business or out of work because of the COVID crisis. But we've a very long, proud history in Mandate, 150 odd years of history. The bar union itself goes back to the 1860s, and we are emergers of several different unions over the years. That formed a really powerful union politically and industrially. So we were one of the unions that set up the Labour Party in the 1913, and it was our founders alongside James Connolly and Jim Larkin and all of that sort of stuff, Michael O'Leyan, who really gives us that long history. But right now we represent 90 70% female workers and about 30% male workers. And yeah, we're active on a whole range of fronts.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Agnese, I think it's your turn.
Yes, so we know that industrial relations system in Ireland is peculiar, so it's not the same in other European countries. So scholars have usually say that this is the industrial relations system in Ireland has a voluntarist approach, and for instance, there are collective bargaining. For instance, at sectoral level and corporate level are not legal, are not ruled, are not, as we can say. So the law doesn't deal with this kind of matters because there is more a voluntarist approach. And but before, between 1987 and 2009, this system was also characterized by a sort of social partnership. So there were agreements settled by unions, employers, and Irish government. So what is now the difference after the first crisis, so financial crisis, and so after 2009, more or less, that what has changed in the industrial relations system in Ireland?
I would say Rhona first.
Yeah, Rhona first and then Dave. Thank you.
Rhona? I think
Rhona might have lost.
Rhona is freezed.
Yes.
Yeah.
Do you want me to answer first?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, Dave, you go first, and I try to see if there is any technical problem with her.
Okay. So between 1987 and 2009, the social partnership era, as it's called, was really, it wasn't industrial relations. It was more a tripartite between the government, the employers groups, and then the trade unions were sitting down initially just to discuss pay and conditions of employment, really. So there was national wage agreements negotiated out of that. Now, there was several agreements in the mid-90s. They extended it beyond the three regular parties of the trade unions, employers, and the government, and they brought in what's called the social pillar, and the civil society groups and charities and all that side of things, to negotiate a wider framework around some of this stuff. And that was all fine as the economy was growing. But what we found then when the crisis hit in 2008, and that the employers were looking for pay cuts, was that the employers first decided that they were going to abandon this social partnership model, and the government went far behind them because they didn't want to have to negotiate with workers. They wanted to be able to slash terms and conditions of employment at a whim, which was the experience of our members. We did a report in 2012 called Decent Work, the Impact of the Recession on Low-Paid Workers. So within the first 3 years of the economic crisis, our members lost over 1/3 of their wages. So that's coming from a very low base already, where most of our members were earning just over €300 per week. So they lost over €100. And the way they lost it was not just through the austerity measures implemented by the government in terms of tax cuts, higher taxes, but also through hours being cut. So you used to work 40 hours per week. I can't cut your wages because you're in a union, but what I'll do is I'll slash your hours. So I'll cut your hours from 40 hours per week down to 20, and now you've got a 50% pay cut. And then they'll hire other people, brand new staff on the minimum wage. So it was a real, attack on living standards for decades. And despite the fact that we've now had an economic recovery, it's interesting that we now have more people working who are in poverty. Back then, we only had 92,000 people who were living in poverty, who were at work, and now it's over 117,000. So we've had a growth in poverty during the economic recovery, as it's been called. But effectively, that's really what the social partnership system was. It was just employers, governments, and unions sitting down, and for those pay cuts, they weren't given, or pay increases, they weren't given for nothing. So what tended to happen was the government would give tell the employers, okay, we've got an agreement, you're going to give a pay increase to workers of 2% or 4% or whatever it was, and what we'll do is we'll give tax cuts. So there was a trading off there of employers giving pay increases, small, pay restraint to a degree, so small pay increases, but the thing that was incentivizing workers to engage in this system was, oh, okay, you're only getting a 2% increase in your pay, but you're getting a bigger increase then as well in your tax. So you'll end up being 5 or 6% better off when you've only got a 2% pay increase. And the error of all of that over those years was that we completely decimated the public sector. Our healthcare system is a disaster now. Our public housing system is a disaster now. All of that has its foundations in the social partnership model that didn't deliver even collective bargaining. So how can you go 23 years of a social partnership model with employers, government and the trade union sitting down and still not come out the other end of it with workers having the right to collectively bargain or the right to be represented by a trade union of their choice? It's something we've been fighting for in this country for over 110 years and we still don't have that right. So social partnership, as far as I'm concerned, was a complete and utter failure.
So related to this question, I'm sorry that Rhona is not here. But always related to this question, we know that recently there was a ruling by the High Court that declared the third chapter, so related to SEO, so sectoral employment orders, again unconstitutional. I say again because in the past there were other two rulings from High Court and Supreme Court that declared REA, so
registered employment agreement.
Registered. It's very complicated, and also yes, RAO. And REA, yes, something like that.
Lots of letters.
Collective bargaining, to be to make it easy. Collective bargaining were declared unconstitutional. Mm-hmm. And now that Industrial Relations Act 2012 that introduced again this collective bargaining, and also that one in 2015 that introduced the SEOs, now even though they were introduced again, now the High Court declared them unconstitutional again. So the collective bargaining in construction sector that was signed in 2017, and now the other collective bargaining that was signed last year, 2019, in the electric contract sector, they are now in risk. They can't exist anymore, right? Or at least the electric one. We don't know about the construction one yet. But can you explain now us what does it mean that the High Court struck down the Chapter 3 of the Industrial Relation Act 2015? Thank you.
Okay, so there's a long history to some of this stuff. So we've got Industrial Relations Acts going back to 1946, that set out collective bargaining on a sectoral basis. So we used to have joint labour committees, registered employment agreements, EROs, employment registered agreements as well. So there's a whole range of things.
Orders.
That's it, employment registered orders. So what happened in 2012 and 13, around that time, was a group of employers got together and decided that they were going to try and deconstruct all of those entitlements, those rights, and they were successful. The courts ruled in their favour and said that it was unconstitutional. So what happened there about 4 weeks ago was that the electrical contractors body, one of them, decided that they were going to pull apart one of these agreements, and the judge decided that he would back that call from those employers. Now, I don't want to get into the whole complex nature of his ruling, because he actually ruled, it's a 63, 64-page document, so it's a long read, but people can find it online if they're interested. But effectively what he's saying is that the Oireachtas, as Rhona mentioned earlier on, our Dáil, our parliament, is the only body that is, through our constitution, is allowed to write legislation. That's what the rulings have all said. And delegating, the Oireachtas delegating decisions to the minister, who then delegates to the Labour Court to come up with collective agreements on paying terms and conditions of employment and pensions and all that sort of stuff, that would be unconstitutional because of the section in our constitution that says the Oireachtas is the only body that can make these laws. Now, that is being appealed by the government at the moment, because it would have serious implications. It means that a lot of statutory instruments, a lot of delegated laws would have to fall similarly and could be challenged. But anyway, to cut a long story short, Ireland doesn't have collective bargaining rights. We're one of the only countries in the developed world that doesn't have any collective bargaining rights. And we've no right to access. So when I worked in unions in other countries, we were allowed to go in and talk to workers. We in Ireland are not allowed to do any of that stuff. And always cited is our constitution as the reason for it. When in reality, the constitution is a block on certain things, but there's other things that can be legislated on and tightened up on. In reality, the High Court ruling 3 weeks ago said that the Labour Court and the Minister had made serious errors in implementing the law, external to the constitutional ruling element. There's two parts to the ruling. The first part was about actually the implementation of that law. And the court was really strong on that and said you didn't even follow your own guidelines in the existing law. And then it went on to say that it could be unconstitutional. So anyway, what we need in Ireland really is a Fair Work Act, something that it gives workers in Ireland the same rights that workers in Sweden and in Norway and in Denmark and in France and everywhere else, that allows workers that voice, that collective voice, to negotiate, whether it's with their employer directly or in other industries on a sectoral basis, on an industry-wide basis. So that's sort of some of the history of it and why we're in the situation we're in. But we're in that situation really because we've always had a right-wing government since the foundation of the state. We've never had a left-wing government. So, if workers want to get a collective bargaining rights and the ability to be represented by a trade union, they're going to have to start voting for left-wing parties, really.
About that, let me stress one point, that this is a political problem. It's not only about collective bargaining, which is, of course, extremely important, but, for example, political strikes are now not possible in Ireland, and I suppose that also means that a general strike is not possible. Is that correct? Rhona, maybe you want to comment on that, since we lost you for a while?
I've returned. Yeah, the internet has failed yet again. The technology is not what it's supposed to be, really. Obviously, in Ireland, the 1990 Industrial Relations Act curtailed a lot of activity for trade unions, how they can organise, what sort of strikes they can take part in, how much notice they have to give, and so on. And it really, was another attempt after many other attempts actually to really declaw the movement, to take away its power. Not that it had a whole lot anyway up to then, because, as Dave was saying, the Constitution has a voluntary system which basically can be ignored by employers. So where you have a right to be in a trade union, they have a right not to recognise it. So by the time of the 1990 Industrial Relations Act, it took away power, obviously, to show solidarity, I suppose, to other working class people or working class political activity. And the obvious example being the Dunstores anti-apartheid strike in the 1980s. That could no longer take place now because of the 1990 Industrial Relations Act. But I think we do need to try and get rid of that act. We do need to have legislation like a workers' charter that Dave was talking about. We do need to talk about our constitutional rights in terms of maybe we need to have a referendum to enshrine them. But certainly we do need to be looking at how we gain political power, because without political power we can't really do these things,
Mm-hmm.
So So, but however, that doesn't mean that we stop or use those as excuses not to struggle or not to take place or take part in battles to defend our rights, which we should always do. And if that means breaking the law, well, the trade union movement was established by breaking the laws. The laws aren't written for us; they're not written for working class people or for workers, and we can see that inequality in the workplace and around the world. So, I mean, we shouldn't use 1990 or anything else as an excuse not to get out and not to start organising, and being militant in that organisation, which we need to do. And I think that will be proved in the next few years in the post-COVID, although it's not post-COVID, COVID is still with us, but people returning to work where health and safety issues are a major concern for people. And, people really, their lives are at risk. So we either get organised in a serious way, or we accept that we're going to be slaughtered, really.
I totally agree. We need to remember, as people in the left, as progressive, or whatever we want to label ourselves, that the rights that we today consider for granted wasn't always there. The right to strike was gained through civil disobedience, through illegal action, was not always there. It was something that people before us has worked hard to gain for us, and we need to defend them and probably to gain more of that. One of the issue with limiting unions, I feel, is that unions are not only a group of workers or association of workers that bargain for a better salary, have an important role of social advancement of the whole society. Me and Agnese, we are from Italy, and they had a huge role in establishment in the battle to gain universal health care. Or we are from the South, they had a huge role in fighting mafia, organized crime, for example, which is not the romantic thing that you can see in the movies, was a very exploiting thing against workers before of all. So yeah, no, I really hope that this is not an excuse, and that we can all contribute for a different Ireland in this sense. Talking about the present, Dave, we have heard here in Ireland about the mobilization of in these days of Debenhams workers. And mandate, the union you work for is their union. Can you explain us a little bit what happened? What is their protest about? What happened with their company? And I will ask you further questions after that.
Okay, so Debenhams, the company, there's two parts to it really. There's Debenhams in the UK and Debenhams in Ireland. They're two separate companies. Debenhams in Ireland decided that they, on the Easter weekend in April, just as the COVID crisis was kicking off, they decided to send an email to all staff to tell them that the stores would no longer open. So there was no conversations, there was no warning. They just said, you are all out of a job. And there's over 1,000 workers that were impacted by that. Some of whom had, 40 years service working for the company here, making huge profits. But what the company did in advance was they transferred all of the valuable assets to the parent company in the UK. So they transferred, for instance, the Debenhams.ie URL of the website. They transferred the leases that they had, which were worth a lot of money, on Henry Street and Patrick Street in Cork. So they're in prime locations. So they transferred all of these assets away and then decided that they were going to let all of the workers go with no redundancy. And there's no money for the redundancy. So the company is put into liquidation, and the workers then would have to seek their 2 weeks pay per year of service, the statutory redundancy, off the state, off the taxpayer. The problem is that they already had a collective agreement with Debehnams, the workers did through their union mandate, and that was 4 weeks pay per year of service. So they're not going to get what was freely agreed between the employer and the trade union. So we've been battling to make people aware of this, and the workers have done a tremendous job all across the country, protesting every single day. They've been stopping stock and assets being taken out of the stores because they're saying that rightly saying that those assets should be sold in order to give the workers what their entitlements are. But our big problem really is that this was all predictable and it was all preventable, in that we've been warning about these situations for years. I myself, along with about a dozen other activists, slept in the Paris bakery in 2013-14. I think it was 2014, for 14 nights to make people aware that this situation was happening. And it was exactly the same thing. The Paris bakery decided to close, liquidate and take the assets away, and left all of the workers with no pay, no redundancy money, none of that stuff. So it was, you know, as I say, predictable. But it wasn't just even Paris bakery. We've had this happen over and over again. We had Cleary's, we've had La Senza, we've had HMV, we've had Gain. You know, the government knows well what's happening. And on the back of the Cleary's one, when Cleary's closed down and left 500 workers out of a job with no redundancy, the government of the day commissioned a report called the Duffy Cahill Report to find solutions to stop this happening. Now that report came out in 2016-17, and the government has sat on it and done nothing to implement it. So the government have facilitated the situation now that the Debenhams workers find themselves in, which is extremely frustrating. And for the workers themselves, and having spoken to a number of them, they're very angry about it. And a lot of people wouldn't know about the Duffy Cahill report and what it does or what it was supposed to do. But one of the things, you know, yesterday, the members from Debenhams met with Leo Varadkar, the minister, but they also met with Sinn Féin and the Labour Party, and they're meeting with all of the different parties to try and get this piece of legislation across the line so that no worker will ever have to go through this stuff again, of having to strike and to battle and to stand outside blocking stock just to get their basic entitlements that they've collectively agreed with their employer.
Yeah, because that's to be honest, it's impressive the militancy work that they are done. It's now 100 days that they are picketing the warehouses. So 24 hours a day. It means day and night in Irish weather. For people outside Ireland, believe me, it's not easy. That really, really kudos to them. So they
the warehouse is covered.
Sorry?
The warehouse is covered in every street, at least.
At least that one. Yeah, we have that. But there are different locations all around Ireland, because it's 11 stores?
11 stores all across the country.
Okay. So instead, for both of you, this is an example of what's going on at the moment. But what is, in your opinion, from your perspective as people working in the unions, the present state of let's say the work world at the moment here in Ireland in the post-lockdown? What was the economic impact of the lockdown? There are other relevant industrial actions or mobilization. Rhona?
Hello? Sorry, all
Yeah.
I can hear is noise. I can't actually what anybody is saying. Can you hear me now? All I can hear is
Yes,
noise.
it's a bit disturbed, but I think we can understand what you say. Let's try.
There's an awful lot. I can't hear very much. What are you asking me?
Okay. If from your point of view, what is the present situation with workers' mobilization post-lockdown? If there are other industrial action at the moment?
I'm finding it very, very difficult.
Okay. We go to Dave and see if the situation gets better.
So, our membership in retail has been, we've had a mix, and in bar trade as well, has been mixed in terms of, if you think, lots of grocery workers have continued to work since this began. So we've been inundated with calls from retail workers wanting to know their rights in terms of health and safety and protections, and needing screens put up and the social distancing element. So there's that side of it. But then on the other side, on the drapery side of things, like Pennies or a lot of the department stores like Arnott's, these places have completely shut down. So there's those members then who been put on a pandemic unemployment benefit. So it's been a mixed bag, but it's been very difficult, not just economically and financially for people, but the stresses on people's mental health that come with this, not just in terms of the lockdown, but and being isolated and not being able to see family and all the rest of it, but the worries of the financial situation in the future and how they're going to be able to pay their bills, and especially when the government's, the best that they thought they could do was with the banks in terms of, and rents and stuff, is to stop evictions, but also enabling the banks to seek interests on the parts of the loan that are deferred. So it's now making the situation worse for a lot of our members and a lot of people. But the situation isn't good right now. And what we have, as a result of the stuff that we were saying earlier on about lack of collective bargaining and entitlements, and we have a lot of employers in Ireland that are very abusive towards their staff, abusive in a whole range of measures. And if you go to the Workplace Relations Commission report every year, you can actually see some of that, the impact of some of that. So, the WRC, the Workplace Relations Commission, do a lot of inspections in workplaces, and from those, for instance, in retail, about 50% of all retail employers, when they're inspected, are found to be in breach of the law. Like almost half of all employers are breaking the law. And what you find is, for every inspection that's done in retail, over €1,000 of unpaid employment is found there. So unpaid wages is returned to those workers on the back of those inspections. Now, there's only about 300 inspections a year in that sector. And then 300 inspections or so in an industry that employs 280,000 people shows you that, the amount of abuse that can and probably is taking place. So it's one of those things that, Rhona mentioned it about, and I know we spoke about it before, about right to access and the ability for trade unions to go in and talk to workers and find out what's happening. That's the key piece of legislation that we really need in this country. So that access that's provided in New Zealand and in Australia and other countries, where the trade union can go in and talk to the workers, not just about collective bargaining, but they can do health and safety inspections, they can do workplace rights inspections. That's the type of thing that we need. And we must remember that trade unions really are just a bunch of workers themselves collectivizing, and it's about democracy in the workplace. And when you have a company that's refusing to allow their workers a level of democracy in the workplace, that's as close as you get in terms of, a fascist type of organization, to prevent people from having a democratic say on their own lives. That's what we're really talking about here. So in terms of this COVID crisis, and going back to your question, we have to, I know Unite, and I know the Irish Congress of Trade Unions have produced reports about the future and what it should look like. We really need to learn from this COVID crisis, and that enabling workers to collectively bargain and enabling workers to join trade unions and be represented is for the betterment of all, for the betterment of all of our society in terms of everything that we do. We need to expand our democracy, not reduce it.
Yeah. And can I ask you, what is your opinion for the next months? Economically, how do you see things going? Because it's not only about a specific industrial action, it's about how, generally speaking, the economic and the society is reacting about what happened.
Are you asking me or Rhona? Rhona's back.
Dave.
Okay,
yes.
I'll be quick on this one. So there's two elements to this, and as there was with austerity, there's the industrial side, so the employers who are already trying to use COVID to reduce terms and conditions of employment, and we've seen it across a number of sectors and a number of employments in retail, in the pharmacy sector, where despite the fact that some of these places have been open from the start and that the government is subsidising the wages of most of these employees up to 85% of their income, a lot of those companies are trying to make workers redundant and trying to offload those. And they're basically using the state's funds to make people redundant, and then they'll hire them back on lower terms and conditions of employment. And this is, I mean, it's part of the capitalist system. The employers have to try and make as many gains as they can whenever they can. So never one in Ireland to miss an opportunity. Employers are trying to screw over workers. So there's that side of things. And we have been balloting and working with our members to resist some of that stuff, but there's unfortunately a huge amount of people in retail and other sectors who are not in unions, and they need to join now if they want to fight back against this stuff. Then on the flip side of that, you asked about economically, there's the government side of it. So there's the industrial and then the government. And the government is borrowing huge amounts of money. And as you'll hear, you know, a lot of the time, oh, this money needs to be paid back. So the question will become, like it did in 2008, who is going to end up paying this back? And we're already looking at the quadrupling of the carbon tax from the programme for government, along with a whole range of other austerity measures that are due to come in. And that's why, going back to what Rhona said earlier on, it's not sufficient for workers just to be organised industrially in their workplace. They have to be organised politically. And I know political strikes are banned and all the rest of it. You can't go on strike for political reasons, and a national strike was mentioned, or a general strike is illegal. But I mean, we can still find ways and means of impacting on the economy if there's a necessity and a want to do such a thing. So I'll leave it at that in terms of the industrial and the political stuff.
So there is not only a problem of things going bad at a general level, but also taking advantage of the situation to restrict, let's say, working rights. Rhona, how is going now? Can you hear us well? Can we try a question? Can you hear us? I think it's not working. No, you are muted now. You are muted. Okay. Now you are muted again. Okay, you are. Okay.
What's the question?
Okay. First I wanted to see if we could communicate. I wanted, if we can, I wanted you tell us about the situation during the pandemic with the seasonal workers in agriculture. We have seen that your union have followed that situation in the past months. And
you're asking me about seasonal workers, yeah?
Yes.
Okay, I can't hear. When you speak, it's all noise. I'll just maybe just go into some of the issue around migrant workers and seasonal workers, which like many things had been, exposed during COVID, or some of the practices and conditions that people were facing in the most exploitative areas of work had been revealed or exposed. Now, obviously, migrant labour is a global issue. It's not just an Irish issue or a European issue. We've seen, I suppose, an increase in migrant labour with globalisation over the last number of decades, with a demand, I suppose, for unskilled workers to do certain types of jobs. Whether a lot of it in Ireland is based around the food business and meat plants, but it's not just those industries. There are other industries where they use migrant labour and cheap labour to boost profits. During the first weeks of lockdown in Ireland, the first week, I think, some Bulgarian workers were transported in, 180 of them, by Ryanair, to work in a farm in North County Dublin, a place called Keelings, which is a very, very profitable agri-food business, which has huge contracts with the major retail outlets in Ireland for soft fruits and vegetables and so on. These workers were flown in, and obviously it was very, very controversial because we had a lockdown, and it seemed to be that people were not being tested, and that there was no regulations in place in terms of quarantine, in terms of where their living conditions were like, and so on. Now, we had a relationship with people from that particular firm going back to 2018, and they were Bulgarian workers as well. And the reason they got in touch with us was because they were signed up, as they are every year, on 3-month or 12-week contracts. And this particular couple got in touch with us because the contract had been cut after 8 weeks and just terminated without any good reason. And as a consequence, they were also then homeless because their accommodation is tied into the job. So when we spoke to them, they revealed to us an awful lot about the practice there, whereby they were working essentially for what amounted to about €200 per week. They had been recruited through an agency in Bulgaria who were charging them something around €500 for their flights and translation fees and so on. So that amounted to about a month's wages, average wage in Bulgaria. So they were paying up front basically a month's wage to be transported over here. Their accommodation was tied into the job. They were given 12-week contracts. A lot of the time they were broken after 8 weeks. And somebody somewhere was making some through an agency of doing this. Now, this is not unusual. It's stuff that happens around the world. But I think one of the aspects for us was that our legislation, or our weak legislation, and all of its loopholes creates a huge problem for us to try and help or defend workers in those scenarios, because, as we said before, we have no access to workplace, we have no collective bargaining rights. Employers don't have to recognise trade unions. There's language barriers, and these people are basically the most vulnerable workers in society in that sense, and they're working for very, very low pay, and are basically intimidated into if in contact with trade unions, they're slightly worried about what that means because of the pressure from employers. And they were also revealed some interesting practices in terms of how they were registered for bank accounts and registered with PPS numbers and so on, which in the normal process of things, it takes a certain amount of bureaucracy here, and as it does in most countries, to set up a bank account. When these workers arrived, the bank was brought out to their canteen, and they were shipped in and signed up to bank accounts on the same day, all in the one go. So from our perspective, this stuff, it looks like kind of gangmasters, and our legislation doesn't have any sort of protections the way the UK legislation after what happened at Morecambe Bay, if you remember, in 2004, where 23 Chinese migrant workers drowned picking cockles off the coast. The UK legislation changed after that to try and regulate the systems where migrant workers, but we have nothing like that here. And I think that's just, it was revealed basically then. We had known about it for quite some time, but it's notoriously difficult to organise in those type of sectors for many, many reasons. But having no access and having no robust legislation in terms of trade union rights, the language barrier, and the local power of companies like this, and that they get from their friends in government, they do have, really, really pushes, makes our job and our task really, really difficult. And our task in reality is to make their jobs better. Our task is not to shut down jobs or to stop people getting work. It's to make work better for people. So, the more or the less we have any rights in this country, and the more that those who want to exploit will get away with. So, and I think it was seen very, very clearly in terms of those migrant workers this summer. And, those migrant workers exist all over Europe, but in Ireland they're particularly vulnerable.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much. Unfortunately, the connection is not perfect, so there was a little bit noise, but I think it was, at least I understood what you said, and I hope it was the same for our viewers. Let me stress the point that this is not only, as you said, a problem in Ireland. We, in particular, as a pan-European movement, we were interested to this particular topic because we have seen from our perspective that the pandemic has highlighted that this same situation was going on in similar way in many other European countries, both in the agriculture sector and in the meat packing industry. There were COVID clusters in Germany, I think in France as well. In Italy, we have seen a big strike from the workers, from the African workers that work in agriculture. They are generally involved in tomato harvesting and orange harvesting during the winter, and they are mostly illegal migrants, and of course their employer take big advantage of that. So, and during the pandemic was evident how much the sector relied, like here in Ireland that the special flight was organized. It was so evident how much this industry rely from migrant work and the level of exploitation that it's inside of that, and the workers self-organized a strike, a big strike. I think I also, as regarding what Rhona was saying about the difficulty of organizing strike workers in this sector, especially for the language barrier and the difficulty to reach out. What's in other countries worked is that now there are second and third generation of well, when you are a third generation, you are technically not a migrant anymore, but still you can speak maybe the language of your parents and you can be a connection. And that's what happened in Italy as well. There is now a new generation of people that is politicized, that has the capacity to be a connection with the new migrants and right and with the general society, and trying to do a work of grassroots organization. And probably that's the key to be used everywhere. We are discussing now inside DiEM about the possibility to support as a pan-European movement this kind of situation, to support the workers around in this kind of situation, because there are people from all the countries that speak all the languages, and maybe in some way we can be a useful environment to put people in connection. We will see. We are trying to work a little bit about that. We'll see what happens. Agnese, you had a question about international cooperation?
Yes.
Point.
So first of all, data tell us that with COVID crisis, trade union density is growing, fortunately. So as in the past was declining a lot, now it seems that this crisis is challenging in a good way trade unions, at least in Ireland, but I think all over Europe. So we know that now the issue of labor sector is an European issue. It's not only a national issue, because with the approval of the recovery funds and before with the approval of the European stability mechanism, labor market, labor legislation, labor law and employment rights were abused in a certain way, because European Union gave us money, funds, but in exchange it asked us to approve new labor market reforms, to reduce employees, workers' rights, and etc. So, as this is a European matter, not just a national matter, are you involved in transnational campaigns? Do you have relations with other European trade unions? Which are the campaigns and which are the actions that you want to take in order to fight this kind of new austerity and new economic plan by European Union?
Yeah, we in Mandate, there's a couple of things on that, on the pan-European and pan-world sort of cooperation that we work on. So Mandate Trade Union, being retail and bar trade, is affiliated to Uni Global Union, and Uni is the World Union for Commerce. So it's not just retail, there's banking in there as well, and a couple of other industries like security. But so we're affiliated to Uni. We do cooperate with them on a whole range of things. But one way, in terms of explaining the practicalities of this, is, so for instance, Uni will negotiate retail around the world now has become global. So in companies like Inditex, for instance, who are Zara and Pull & Bear, and they have a whole range of different brands, they are in almost every country now in the world. So we try to facilitate and help Uni to negotiate, global agreements, as they're called. So an agreement was done just over 10 years ago in Inditex for a global agreement. So Inditex is supposed to recognise the union in each of the countries that it operates. And another one was done in IKEA as well. Unfortunately, though, these companies don't necessarily abide by those global agreements when it comes to the local stuff. So, for instance, IKEA has a requirement in its own sort of constitution and how it operates. If you supply wood to IKEA, you must recognise, as a separate company, you must recognise the union in that jurisdiction by law. Otherwise, they won't take the product off you. However, IKEA in Ireland refuses to sit down and negotiate with Irish workers through their union mandate. So, I mean, what we find really in these global agreements is that the company will always just go by the minimum it has to within the jurisdiction that it's in. And the fact that there's no collective bargaining rights in Ireland means that IKEA just doesn't bother sitting down and negotiating. So it's frustrating. In terms of pan-European stuff that Mandate has been involved in, I've been a coordinator of the Right to Water campaign in Ireland, and there's a Right to Water EU campaign as well, which ran the Citizens Initiative there a number of years ago to try and force the EU into a position of not commodifying water, not turning it into a financial instrument or the financialization of the industry itself, and everybody having the human right to water stuff. They got over 1 million signatures. I believe they got 1.9 million signatures in the end, 1.7 million within the period of time that they had allocated. But the EU just rubbished it and didn't do anything with it. So it can be fairly frustrating dealing with the EU on some of these things where they just, we're going to pretend to have some level of democracy here and allow citizens, initiatives where the citizens of Europe can instigate some piece of law, and then they just rubbish it when they disagree with it. Same thing with TTIP, they rubbished it as well and didn't allow it. So we deal with the Right to Water EU guys as well on a regular basis and have coordinated. We brought over, for instance, people from Greece during the Right to Water mobilizations in 2015. To talk about what was going on over in Greece, where, as you mentioned, the EU, the IMF, the Troika effectively were forcing the privatization of their water system over there. And it was happening in Italy as well, where they were pressuring the Italian government to privatize too. I think you guys...
There was a referendum in Italy.
You had a referendum.
Yeah.
A similar referendum that was just ignored too, from what I could gather from the European movement. But it's interesting, we met with people in Rome who were switching back on people's water because there was a water shut-off program going on in 2015 and 16, and they dressed themselves up like Super Mario so that they couldn't be identified. But this stuff is happening all across Europe in relation to water, and this is... at the heart of it, the EU and its institutions and its structures are about the private sector, the commercialization of everything, whether it's water, housing, it's all being done for a profit. And you will have your right to water as long as somebody can make a profit out of it on the other end of it, or you will have a house as long as somebody can make a profit out of it. So we need to tackle that on a pan-European basis where we can. So it's, they're some of the campaigns that we've been involved in. I don't want to go on too long because there's loads and loads of campaigns.
Sorry.
You have mentioned social campaigns, social services campaigns, but also in terms of wage setting, industrial relations. Do you think that would be a risk with these recovery funds to have like that European Union asks in exchange of funds and money, again, making the wages lower and reforms to make the labor market more flexible, etc. So a loss in employees, workers' rights.
Well, I think there's dangers there. Anytime you get money off the Troika, any of the members of the Troika, they come with conditions. And, there's the European Stability Mechanism and there's all of these things in play. But again, the EU has a specific agenda, and it's over the years it's become more out there. People can see exactly what the EU has been up to. There was a really good report done by Emma Clancy in the EU. She works over in the European Parliament, and in the report it talks about over 60 times that the EU in the last number of years has instructed countries to defund their public health system. And then all of a sudden we get a COVID crisis and people are saying, why are so many people dying? Well, the EU had a role in telling people to stop funding their public healthcare system. So, in terms of the wage setting mechanisms, there is discussion in the EU happening right now about a harmonizing of a minimum wage structure thing, which is hugely dangerous because we all have different costs of living. I mean, for instance, the biggest resistors of that would be the Swedish and the Danish sort of trade unions. They wouldn't want anything because their wages are much higher than other parts of Europe. So, you're not comparing apples with apples, or comparing apples with oranges here.
Harmonization should go up, not down.
Exactly, but it's not going to happen that way.
Yeah.
And what you have then is competing workers across Europe, for whether it's manufacturing jobs, call center jobs, whatever it is. The EU and capitalism are, they're hand in glove as far as I'm concerned. And that's all about keeping wages as low as possible. So when workers in Ireland got organised in the call centres, all of a sudden those call centres up and moved to Eastern Europe because it's cheaper there. They get organised over there. The call centre then moves to somewhere else. And this is what we have to fight. But at the same time, it's a very difficult battle. I don't trust the EU on handling industrial matters. So I'm a big believer in workers themselves from the grassroots up, winning terms and conditions of employment, which, for instance, Dunnes Stores members, our members in Dunnes Stores fought for secure hour contracts back in 2015. They went on strike. And the very next day after the strike, the employer decided to cut people's hours, to move workers from one section of the shop to another, to discipline them. They changed their hours of attendance so that if they were, in particular, they went after women, where if women had childcare minding facilities organised, they now moved their hours around so that they had to organise alternative childcare. So the workers realised they're not going to win this industrial battle. They're going to have to fight for legislation, which took 4 years. But last year we had the what was called the banded hours legislation implemented. So every worker now in Ireland has a right, after 12 months of service, to put in a request to their employer to get whatever hours they've worked on average over the previous 12 months. They get a new contract that reflects those hours. So the employer can't cut their hours way down and victimize them if they take industrial action or if they do anything else. So these are the types of campaigns from the grassroots. Those Dunnes Stores workers went on strike. They organised, 6 weeks after the strike, they organised a public rally where they marched, thousands of people marched through Dublin. They went and knocked on TDs, our public representative doors. They lobbied for 4 years and they managed to win the legislation. I don't think you're going to win that type of thing by just asking the EU to do it. It's just not going to happen.
Of course, EU legislation is not a substitution for local organizing. If it's meant in that way, of course, it's not gonna work. And I agree with you that that is exactly the reason why DiEM25 was born. That we need to change the EU as it is, and this will never happen if we don't succeed at general level as progressive to mobilize people and also unions for the grassroots. I agree that probably the wage harmonization is not a successful way. Probably a working rights harmonization would be more interesting, to give all the workers in Europe the same arms to fight back. You know what I mean? But that will happen. When there will be a global, a pan-European demand for that.
I would love to see that. I would love to see a pan-European demand for collective bargaining, workers having the right to be represented by a trade union. Now, as I just mentioned, when the Troika came in, the EU came in to give a bailout to Greece, they also deconstructed their collective bargaining laws. So, I mean, we have an institution here that's just not in favour of workers' rights, the institution itself. But if you look at the Commission and the governments that are currently represented on that are all very, well, not all, but mostly very right-wing governments. And then you look at the European elections last year to the Parliament, and again, we returned even further to the right than the previous one. So if we couldn't get collective bargaining to the EU on the previous Parliament, we're certainly not getting it on this one. And I'm not saying we shouldn't try. I'm just saying that in the meantime, while we're trying to organise on a pan-European basis, workers' rights and all the rest of it, we still have to try and win it on a national basis ourselves.
No, of course, it's a it's a bilateral fight that we need to do. What I see in Ireland is there is an overlapping, like everywhere maybe, of local factors and international factors. There is Irish peculiar history and class history, let's say. There is the EU element, and there is the multinationals factor that we did not have the time to explain maybe properly. There are also the current industrial relations structure is also the result of the will to open Ireland doors to USA multinational companies. And that's another element, in my opinion, that probably has a greater weight than what the EU says. But in general, we need to change let's say, the political wind in Europe. If we don't succeed to do that, and mobilizing workers on these things, it's probably one of the way to do that. Also to contrast this idea that working classes are completely abandoned from this feeling of abandonment that they have, people has felt in the last years. We have a question from the audience, and then I would say that our time is ended for today. Is Ian. Ian is a DiEM member that is living in Germany and is watching from abroad. I thought that the idea of an EU minimum wage was to stop the race to the bottom in terms of wages. What would you say about that?
Yeah, it could be the idea behind it, and it's a bit like the faults that are very clearly on display. And I know Yanis Varoufakis has spoken about some of this, about you can't have a European central bank and everybody, all countries operating in different economies. I mean, it doesn't work. So the EU minimum wage might be a good idea, but where do people think, if the minimum wage in Ireland, which is quite high by European standards, right? But it's quite high because employer PRSI is so low in Ireland. So if you take in employee compensation, it's not as high. It's actually about average or below average. But if you're...
And then you have to pay accommodation as well.
Yeah, exactly. A much higher accommodation costs here than elsewhere, and basically non-existent public housing compared to many other countries like Austria or Sweden. But so again, I mentioned it earlier, we need to compare apples with apples and not apples with oranges. And when you look at how minimum wages work across the rest of Europe, Sweden, for instance, has no minimum wage. And they're happy with that situation because they have strong collective bargaining rights over there, and sectoral employer-based ones. They've got a whole range of them. Same in Germany. It's not really, I don't think Germany has a national minimum wage. I might be wrong on that, but they have regional minimum wages.
Italy doesn't have.
There's no minimum wage in Italy. I mean, so if you bring in a minimum wage, and what has happened even in Ireland since we brought in a minimum wage in 2002 is that most employers see it as a ceiling and not a floor. It's supposed to be that, but then it becomes, and you hear this from the media, you hear it from politicians, but sure, they're earning the minimum wage. That's sufficient. That's fine. But then it sort of restricts workers' ambitions about what they should be earning. And while, you know, if you're working on the minimum wage here in Ireland with the costs of childcare and the costs of healthcare, the costs of everything that goes with it, you're living in poverty. And that's why there's the living wage, which is, I think, €12.30 or so now, compared to the minimum wage, which is €10.10 per hour. So, but anyway, going back to the question, to answer it specifically, it's not that it's necessarily a bad idea. It's just that it wouldn't work. It can't work because we all have different economies. Some countries, European-wide, have the ability to print their own money. Ireland doesn't because we're in the euro. And the central bank has that facility, so you can't really run an economy in this way. You know, the euro is a failure itself because for reasons that we've seen in the run up to the bailouts that Ireland got and all the rest of it. So bringing in European wide wage is just not going to help. It's not going to work, but it's not going to help.
We need to harmonize probably before so many other aspects like working rights, like financial justice. And that's probably material for another episode.
And by the way, because we're talking about the collective bargaining rights, rightly so, and that's a huge part of it. But what the EU could do, if it wanted to address some of these issues around exploitation in agriculture and everywhere, is bring in extremely strong penalties for abusive employers. So there's the carrot and the stick, and the carrot is really the collective bargaining that, you know, enabling workers to actually negotiate and expanding democracy. But where you have an employer, for instance, I mentioned about unpaid wages earlier on. If an employer currently steals from their staff, doesn't pay them the right wage, and there's an inspection and it's found, they're told to return the money that they stole. They're not given a penalty necessarily, right? So it's like me running into a bank and robbing the bank, and on the way out, a police officer says to me, "Caught you in the act, now give that money back." And then you can walk away and nothing happens to you. That's exactly the system we have at the moment. We need strong penalties.
Absolutely. Anti-union behavior, as we call in Italy, should be sanctioned. Should be sanctioned because it's not a damage only to the union, to the workers. It's a damage to the collective society, to everybody. Okay, thank you very much, Dave. I'm very sorry that the conversation with Rhona didn't work well. We will try to do something else with her in the future, maybe focusing on women and the history of Ireland, since she also has some knowledge about that. I was very happy to have this conversation to all of you. Thank you, Agnese, also for co-hosting this episode with me. I think it's important to start this kind of conversation at local and national level. We need to work at all levels to improve working rights everywhere and democracy. Thank you again.
Well, thank you for having me.
See you the next time.
See you again. Thank you again.
Bye.
Bye.